Next up, the deconstruction of consciousness with psychedelics in research and therapy. Dr. Chris Timmerman is the head of the DMT Research Group at Imperial College London, focusing on the action of psychedelics and advanced meditation on the brain and mind. His interdisciplinary work aims to explore the potential benefits of altered states to human consciousness and mental health. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Chris Timmerman.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's very nice to be here. Thank you for Sarah and Silja, the organizers, and Nico for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be in this beautiful country. And be among the speakers of this great collection of this great lineup and seeing you all here. And so today I'm gonna, a bit of change of tone and gear in the presentations that we've had so far, the wonderful presentations that have focused a bit more on practice, many of them. And I'm a researcher. My fascination is the mind, and how do we understand consciousness better so that we can leverage the opportunities, the affordances of these psychedelic experiences. And also of note, I think something that was mentioned in the previous panel, I'm a big proponent of the issues that arise sometimes when we fall into this trap of psychedelic exceptionalism. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to bring forward also in this talk is how is it that we can, psychedelics maybe help us to maybe exceptionalize our everyday realities, our everyday experiences, rather than having to resort always to this exceptional experience induced by psychedelics. And so our work is, and in the DMT Research Group, really comes from almost 10 years now, where we've been doing these extreme, inducing these extreme states of consciousness with both DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, and as of recent also with advanced meditation practices, such as those achieved in jhana meditation states and in non-dual meditation. And so our main way of working is that we do neuroscience experiments. We put people in fMRI scanners and we collect their brain activities, but also we take a very deep and closer look to the nature of those experiences. And the conviction somehow is this old psychedelic promise that somehow psychedelics provide a laboratory of the mind. They provide a way to become, that help us become aware of these ongoing processes that make up the way that we make our experience of ourselves and of the world. And what I will try to answer in this talk, a very ambitious proposal, is why are psychedelics meaningful in consciousness and mental health research, or their applications in therapy? Why do we care so much about these states? And the tentative answer that I'd like to propose is that they are meaningful because they modulate these fundamental structures of human experience. They help us deconstruct and reconstruct those aspects that make up our experience of the world. Right? And that has implications for us interested in inquiring about the nature of the mind, or how does the brain work, on the one hand. But I also would like to bring forward this idea that also that has deep implications to how we leverage these opportunities for mental health research, or mental health more generally, or any sort of human development that can arise from psychedelic practice. And so I'll start with the first bit and a clarification. What is it that I mean that psychedelics act as tools of deconstruction? The essential idea is that psychedelics perturb the taken for granted way in which we approach our habitual experience of ourselves and of the world and of others and our relations in a very deep and meaningful way. And so what is this taken for granted attitude? This comes from the philosophical phenomenological tradition, as developed by Edmund Husserl almost 100 years ago, where he basically states that the way in which we experience the world is this sort of naive attitude. We tend to think that what's happening in our experience of the world out there is an actual representation of what the world out there is. And by doing that, we neglect our active role in that construction of the world. And so this applies to our conscious experience of the world, but also our conscious experience of ourselves. And this principle kind of aligns very much with a lot of meditation traditions. And some of recent developments in psychotherapy, the model of psychological flexibility essentially, that many times as well we have a taken for granted attitude to our own beliefs, to our own ideas of our sense of self. And so there's a lot of pathologies or mental health conditions or suffering more broadly that arises from this idea of a fusion that we have with our beliefs about ourselves. And we take them as if they are part truly of ourselves, as opposed to understanding that it is also a process of construction. And so a good example of this in science is the insights that somehow psychedelics have provided about the sense of self, and how is it that we construct the sense of self in the brain. And so there's a lot of detail here. I'm not going to go too much into it, but essentially, for example, the research has shed light on these mechanisms, these circuits or connections in the brain, that when you disrupt them with the use of LSD or psilocybin, they induce or they favor a form of ego dissolution, a disruption of the sense of self. And so by inducing this experience of ego dissolution, we're enabled, as people who care about the mind and want to understand the brain and the mind, understand the brain mechanisms of that essential structure of human experience, such as the sense of self, right? So the hippocampus, a region very involved in memory, and we think in autobiographical memories, we think it plays a big role in how we construct our autobiographical sense of self, the sense of identity, the declarative, conscious aspects that make up who we are. And this has also been shown with both LSD and psilocybin, and then recent evidence showing how psychedelics also disrupt parts of the brain that relate to our embodied sense of self. So our sense of self is not just the stories that we have about ourselves in a very conscious way, but also those implicit bodily processes that are continually engaged and are very much linked to our emotions and our sense of homeostasis. So a very core fundamental aspect of the sense of self also appears to be disrupted in these psychedelic experiences. And when we do science on them, they reveal something about their mechanisms, their workings in the brain. Right? And so as a scientist interested in this idea of deconstructing our human experience, I became particularly fascinated with this idea that there could be states of consciousness that could induce a more radical form of deconstruction, or almost a total form of deconstruction, if you will, of our human experience. Right? And so in the quest for understanding consciousness, a very attractive approach would be somehow to take up all the stuff that makes up conscious experience so that you reach some form of bedrock of human consciousness. And this has been proposed by philosopher Thomas Metzinger as states that are achieved in these minimal phenomenal experiences. And he links them very much to what happens in these advanced meditation states. So radical deconstruction of consciousness where there's no self, no other contents of consciousness whatsoever, but simply awareness itself. So the experience is simply that of being aware. You have a minimal model to approach the question of consciousness. And this can inform a relationship of who we are, consciousness more broadly, the relationship between the sense of self and consciousness, not just in these lab environments, but also in these deeper existential questions that we all have about what is this all about, some sort of way. What is the bedrock of human experience? And so it was initially proposed about meditation. And upon some sort of acquaintance and reports about 5-MeO-DMT, I became very interested in whether or not that experience induced by 5-MeO-DMT as an extreme state of consciousness could also correspond to this form of absolute or total deconstruction of consciousness. And so in our initial experiments, we're still doing some of these lab experiments, we're coming to realize that indeed it seems like in this ego dissolution, in these 5-MeO-DMT experiences, when you compare them with NN-DMT, what you would have is a very enhanced form of ego dissolution with very little visual imagery and very little of these entity encounters, almost no entity encounters whatsoever. So maybe providing a form of model for this idea of a minimal phenomenal experience. I think this is a very nice illustration. It's for a meditation paper, where essentially the idea would be that in our habitual experience, this would be all the stuff that makes up what's happening in our minds, this construction of human experience with all the different contents. And in these extreme states of consciousness with 5-MeO DMT or advanced meditation, you would deconstruct these into its simplest, more fundamental forms. So this is the quest that we were on. And so we went out at the beginning. It was very hard for us to get approvals to do this study with 5-MeO DMT. And so we did a study where we went out into retreats where people were undergoing 5-MeO DMT experience just for their own personal reasons for therapy or personal development. And we developed this initial model of the phenomenology. This was done work with a researcher at our group, James Sanders, who performed this model after our interviews. And essentially, we mapped out the progression of these effects in the 5-MeO DMT experience. So I'm just going to go through some of these phases. So at the beginning, this onset aspect of the 5-MeO DMT experience, a sense of acceleration, there's a lot of bodily and visual and thought content, a feeling of an expanding body, and also some visuals, shattering visuals. This is a report. At the very beginning, it was like something was crumbling, like disintegrating. It was black, but I saw these patterns, as if there was a pattern that was somehow crumbling, and it opened up to something big and enormous, and that was very, very quick. Second stage, the stage of immersion and merging, where there's a partial disconnection now happening with the environment. There's intense positive or negative emotions that could be felt, sometimes even simultaneously for some individuals. But intriguingly, now this emotion is feeling as depersonalized, as not happening within the self. I could feel energy centered in the torso, warm energy, very beautiful energy. The emotions are giving birth to energy within you. I was feeling like I'm letting go of something. I didn't really exist as a person. My surroundings didn't exist. It was as if I was the emotions and the energy at the same time. And then into the deeper parts of the experience, many individuals went into this abstract stage where the experience is now radically restructured. It's described in these very idiosyncratic and particular visuospatial characteristics, and there's no other contents of experience. So there was no limits to the experience, no objects, no dimensions even, no thoughts, no senses, simply a feeling of like a pyramid or something. But it's not like I actually saw the pyramid. It was more like the feeling of a pyramid. And so now the experience starts to gain these sort of very minimal aspects that appear to be very, very particular. And then in about 30% of these high-dose 5-MeO DMT sessions, we encountered what we labeled as this everything and nothing stage of the experience, where there's an extreme reduction of all possible distinctions of the contents of the experience, no spatial nor temporal qualities, no subject-object dichotomies, no features of the self, no contents of the experience whatsoever. I was not there. It was like I was accessing whiteness, quiet, blissful, enormous whiteness. I was everything. There was no controller or observer. It was not me. I don't know what happened. I somehow had a glimpse of the wholeness, the totality of everything. So this gave us an initial step into this idea that somehow it could be true that in these 5-MeO DMT experiences, there will be a state achieved. There would be this total deconstruction or very radical deconstruction of human experience, and therefore a really unique opportunity for consciousness research. And so our analysis indeed saw that in this everything and nothing stage, really there's no embodied self, there's no narrative self, no thoughts or reflection, a complete disconnection from the environment. And the phenomenal distinctions are very, very minimal or almost completely absent. So for the psychologists out there, it's like this idea of the gestalts. There's so much stuff going on, and at the same time, nothing can be made out of that. No gestalts can be somehow formed, no shapes can be extracted from that experience. And our brain analysis of this is EEG, this is in the wild, this is not the best way to conduct brain research, but the preliminary ones really show the state of disinhibition in the brain. It's almost like the loosening of constraints that are happening in the brain. Very similar to what happens with psilocybin and LSD and DMT even, but even to a greater extent, it seems. A radical state of disinhibition. And so the question arises, how is it that a supposed minimal phenomenal experience can be linked to a stage of disinhibition or entropy or chaos in the brain? And so the model that I'm currently working on, the hypothesis, if you will, a good way to think about it is a system that you apply a form of heat. We can think of this system as the mind or the brain. And so if to the brain or the mind you apply a critical amount of temperature, these patterns will start to emerge. When it is operating at this criticality moment is where our conscious experience is actually taking place. Our actual conscious experience right now and through our lives, whenever we are conscious and aware, is really a very delicate balance between this order and disorder, this heat and cold, where these structures of meaning can somehow emerge. And so when you reduce the temperature, when the brain becomes more boring, more uniform, you would have no experience whatsoever. And this is what brain research tells us. In anesthesia, it tells us in dreamless sleep. There is no experience, and the brain has less information, less heat. And so the intuition would be that somehow this 5-MeO experience, if it is a minimal experience, would be somehow closer to this lower temperature. But the brain data really shows us the opposite. That is a state of high temperature. And rather than there being no information whatsoever, there's just too much information. And there's so much information that our human capacities, our attentional systems, our meaning-making capacities are unable to grasp a specific form of content. And therefore, you would have this experience of everything and nothing happening at the same time. We think it's very similar to what is described many times in advanced meditation practices. An experience that is pregnant with possibilities, or as the philosopher Thomas Metzinger puts it, a form of epistemic openness, where we're open to all forms of knowing or meaning that can arise in that experience without really solidifying into any single one. And so we were particularly interested in this comparison. And I really dig very deep on an advanced meditator that would be interested in participating in one of our 5-MeO DMT studies so that we can maybe compare these states. And we found a Lama, a Western Lama, a very advanced meditation practitioner with over 20 years of experience or in actual retreats with meditation, who received 2 doses of 5-MeO DMT, a low and a high dose, 5 milligrams and 12 milligrams, intranasal form of 5-MeO DMT. And this is very preliminary findings where we find that there's a lot of overlaps in these advanced meditation states and the 5-MeO DMT state. However, when it came to so-called non-duality, which is kind of like the target experience that we are particularly interested in here, this advanced meditation states, the practitioner did not recognize the 5-MeO DMT dosages, inducing that. As an intriguing sort of thing, because it did recognize the hedonic manifestation of non-duality as actually being very much present in this 5-MeO DMT state. This is what he calls an yam. And I think I'm not an experienced meditator myself, but I think in meditation circles it's viewed as a bit of a trap, right? In which you are somehow drawn into the appearance of this non-dual experience, and it feels good and pleasant, and you want to kind of stay there. So it hints us into this grasping that is to be always avoided in this advanced meditation practices. And so we're still understanding these results, and we're really looking forward to taking this further with other advanced meditators and understanding these distinctions. So what is really happening here? Is it about the development of sustained practice that makes the difference potentially? Or is there something about dose? Maybe with a high enough 5-MeO DMT dose, it would be achieved anyway. All right. So going back to our initial formulation is that the idea that psychedelics deconstruct these fundamental structures of experience, but most of the studies really focus on this idea of deconstruction. And I think it's very implicit as well in many of the models of psychedelic therapy. You have these high-dose psychedelic experiences, and it's all about this letting go, acceptance, and so on, which I think has a lot of value. But at the same time, there's a lot of constructive processes that are happening in psychedelic experience. And that can relate to visual imagery, that can relate to the amount of increased ideation or semantic novelty that many of us think is underlying these processes of creativity enhancements that can happen in a psychedelic experience, the way that language is modulated. It was talked about before. I think really leverages on the potential for psychedelics for both innovation and creativity more broadly. And then in the psychedelic therapy space and personal development or whatever purpose, all these experiences of insights, trauma recollections, or supposedly forgotten memories that arise, all of these speaks about emergence of meaning that is happening in the experience. Emergence of meaning, whether it be like some form of thought process, of ideation, but also in perception itself. There's a process of construction that is meaningful for individuals. And so we studied this with DMT experiences, essentially, this process of construction, and more specifically with the phenomena of these entity encounters as these processes of emergence of meaning that are happening in these NN-DMT experiences. So I'm not going to go over all the reports. These are the illustrations from our participants and their reports, just to give you a sense of the variety and the richness of these entity encounters. Colorful rooms, grandfatherly figures, and then I'll read this one. I was being shown the interconnectedness by the beings. It was as if a presence or something was trying to make me pay attention to lessons so that I could remember them. And a lot of it seemed to be about compassion, gratitude, empathy, and kindness. So we have these interesting, intriguing, constructive processes. And so we went out, and as scientists, we performed our research on this and understanding these entity encounters. What's happening in the brain when the brain is organizing again and developing these forms of meaning that are emerging. And so we did a continuous infusion study, and this was led by Lisa Luan, who's a PhD student, actually just graduated with us, where we performed a continuous infusion of DMT. We maintained the peak of the DMT experience for 30 minutes, so a pretty intense, full-on experience. And we captured brain activity whenever people said in real time that they were having an entity encounter. And so they were instructed to just say yes if you have an entity encounter right now at this moment, at several moments during the experience. And then we performed our brain scans, and what revealed us is that when there were no entity encounters, you again would have this global state of disinhibition in terms of brain activity. But when you had the entity encounters compared to when you didn't have them, you would have a reduction of this entropy, of this chaos. You would have a lowering of the temperature, going back with the analogy that I explained before. So these moments of finding meaning within the experience, in this case, in the form of the perception or this encounter with these entities, is some form of stabilization, momentarily stabilization of the system, right? Finding signal within the noise of the experience, if you will. And so where would this take place in our model before? Something in between the 5-MeO-DMT and your habitual experience, where you would have this form of dynamic meaning-making, right? Where you would have the chaos, the entropy, the noise, and then the signal emerging. And then again the noise, and then the signal emerging, right? These entity encounters as this sort of like pockets where there's self-organization emerging. And so how does this inform practice? And this is the more speculative part of the talk, but I hope it can speak to also other people here. How is it that we can leverage these forms of deconstruction and construction that are dynamic and are always happening in psychedelic experiences? I gave the examples of DMT and 5-MeO-DMT and even in meditation. But I think these are useful models that can be applied to different forms of psychedelic practice. And so the broad principle of deconstruction in general, I think is very much related to what happens with other altered states of consciousness, is that forms of deconstruction enable a form of awareness. By perturbing the usual way in which we experience the world, we can become aware of how we experience the world. We can have enabling some form of distance to our habitual experience, and therefore become aware of our thought processes, our emotional processes, and our relational processes. Enabling this sort of shift from a natural attitude to a phenomenological attitude, from a form of cognitive fusion where I'm stuck with my maladaptive patterns to a cognitive diffusion to separate myself from those patterns. And from a point of view of transparency, where my thought processes, my emotions, my cognitions are invisible to me. It's like looking out through a very clear window. I'm not aware of the window. I'm not aware in the way my mind and brain construct my habitual experience of the world, to a form of opacification, where the experience shows me that these are mechanisms that my mind and my brain is participating in this dance of life and experience that we're continuously creating moment by moment. And we see it very much in the evidence, right? In the evidence on what is guiding these therapeutic benefits. And so, for example, we know that peak effects occurring during a psychedelic session appear to lead to mental health improvements. These peak experiences, I mean, for example, mystical type experiences, cathartic experiences, or insightful experiences. So engaging the spiritual side, the emotional side, and the cognitive side. These extreme states, right? These meaning emerging states that are happening throughout the experience, they predict the improvement in mental health indicators. So they matter. They appear to be an essential part of the mechanism. But I think what these forms of the dynamics of meaning making tell us is that indeed these effects are also dynamic within a session. I love this old figure by Hans-Karl Leuner, one of the pioneers of psychedelic therapy, where the idea is here that you would have these peak moments of the experiences that are meaningful and that appear to be conductive for positive mental health outcomes coming in a dynamic fashion. They come in waves, if you will. And it's almost as if, again, the brain or the mind or our organism is in this process of deep perturbation where there's these affordances of meaning, and there's somehow this state of deconstruction. Our systems are gripping into these pockets of meaning that are emerging from moment to moment. And so the key question, I think, is how is it that psychedelic therapy can be leveraged, psychedelic practice in general can be leveraged, so that these dynamics are scaffolded into more meaningful experiences and better outcomes in the long term, right? And so based on broadly these ideas, we developed this model of psychedelic apprenticeship with a couple of colleagues, where we put the emphasis on good psychedelic practice on a relational process between the person who's having the experience and a second person. Another person that could be a therapist, that could be a guide, that could be a trip sitter, that can be even maybe potentially a researcher, that could be a spiritual practitioner, and so on and so forth, right? And the idea would be that somehow this second person is embodying a lineage of practice, of know-how, and they have undergone the experience themselves many, many, many times, and therefore can provide a gradual orientation in this process of becoming aware and leveraging these forms of construction and deconstruction as scaffolds for meaning making. And so this is essentially the essence of practice that is perfected intuitively and sometimes very declaratively by many of the good practitioners, the very good therapy or psychedelic therapy practitioners. And the evidence seems to be pointing in that direction as well, that these relational processes, these second-person processes that emerge in the process of psychedelic therapy, for example, the therapeutic alliance and the rapport between therapist and patient, mediate the meaningful experiences that occur during a process of psychedelic therapy. Again, the scaffolds for meaning-making by leveraging this process of deconstruction and reconstruction. And so I think that as there's an interesting moment that is happening now, we're entering kind of like this psychedelic practice 2.0, where the initial one was a lot about the psychedelic therapy sort of process where you have the high dose, and there's a lot of work happening in session which is mostly about trying to guide the safety of the experience. And I think there's a lot of richness that has emerged from that, but there's a lot that we can, I think, improve on that idea by leveraging what is happening actually in a session and understanding these processes so that people can have safer and more meaningful experiences. And I think psychedelic know-how here is the key, psychedelic know-how of the therapist and guide, but also of the user himself or themselves as they go on repeated sessions and they perfect their own practice. There's a form of know-how that is developed. And the key element is, I think, learning how to read the signal in an ocean of noise in the psychedelic experience. To understand what is a meaningful experience is to understand what to learn from an experience, both before and after, but also during the experience itself. In the same way that a novice surfer that goes out in the ocean needs to understand and learn how to read the waves that are meaningful to catch from the ocean, filled with waves that will not provide that sort of good ride. And so out of session, there's a lot said and a lot we understand about preparation and integration, but I think there's a lot of in-session things that we need to take a closer look into. Understanding mechanisms of attention or metacognition, thinking about thinking, or cognitive control that emerge during a psychedelic experience, I think will be absolutely key for us to understand. Our current idea, at least right now in neuroscience, is that in acute psychedelic experience, your executive functions are diminished. Right? It's almost like these things are inhibited, but there's a range of complex processes that are absolutely key. What does it mean to let go? How is attention deployed in a meaningful way when people are having these meaningful experiences? And so I'm really excited about those possibilities in the future, understanding these things better. And so this is our DMT Research Group. It's a team effort, all of these insights, and thank you very much for your attention.